As I read more about Petrini, however, I discovered that slow food is about more than meals. It's an instantiation of two deep, innovative ideas that can be applied to many different attempts to build a reform movement in response to the excesses of modernity. The first such idea is the power of appealing alternatives. As Michael Pollan summarizes in an insightful 2003 article about slow food, by the 1980s, Carlo Petrini had become dismayed by the hangdog dourness of his comrades on the left. There's a personal satisfaction in grimly pointing out the flaws in a system, but sustainable change, Petrini came to believe, requires providing people with an enjoyable and life-affirming alternative. Petrini didn't simply write a sharply worded op-ed about the corruptive forces of McDonald's. He instead promoted an appealing new relationship with food that would make fast food seem evidently vulgar. Those who suffer for others do more damage to humanity than those who enjoy themselves, Petrini explained. The second idea intertwined with slow food is the power of pulling from time-tested cultural innovations. There's a temptation in activism to propose radically new ideas, as this preserves the utopian possibility of a pristine solution. Petrini recognized, however, that when it came to presenting an appealing alternative to fast food, he would be wise to draw from traditional food cultures that had developed through trial and error experimentation over many generations. Slow food doesn't just support longer meals, it promotes a style of communal dining that had been common in Italian villages for centuries. It doesn't just support fresher ingredients, it recommended dishes that your great-great-grandmother might have served. Traditions that survive the gauntlet of cultural evolution, he believed, are more likely to catch on. In his 2003 article, Pollan admits that he was at first skeptical of this nostalgic aspect of the movement, writing early in his essay, "Slow foodies were antiquarian connoisseurs, I figured," with about as much to contribute to the debate over the food system as a colloquium of buggy whip fanciers might have to add to the debate over SUVs. As he learned more about Petrini's innovative activism, however, his attitude changed. Slow food wasn't looking backward to escape the present, but instead to find ideas to help reshape the future. Pollan goes on to recant his initial skepticism and admits that the movement had a serious contribution to make to the debate over environmentalism and globalism. Once isolated, Petrini's two big ideas for developing reform movements, focus on alternatives to what's wrong and draw these solutions from time-tested traditions, are obviously not restricted to food in any fundamental sense. They can apply to any setting in which a haphazard modernism is conflicting with the human experience. This claim is validated by the many new slow movements that arose in the wake of slow food's original success, targeting other aspects of our culture that were suffering from an unthinking haste. As the journalist Carl Honore documents in his 2004 book In Praise of Slowness, these second-wave movements include slow cities, which also started in Italy where it's called City-Slow, and focuses on making cities more pedestrian-centric, supportive of local business, and, in a general sense, more neighborly. They also include slow medicine, which promotes the holistic care of people as opposed to focusing only on disease, and slow schooling, which attempts to free elementary school students from the pressures of high-stakes testing and competitive tracking. More recently, the slow media movement has emerged to promote more sustainable and higher quality alternatives to digital clickbait, and the term slow cinema is increasingly used to describe realistic, largely non-narrative movies that reward extended attention with deeper insight into the human condition. The slow movement was first seen as an idea for a few people who like to eat and drink well, explained the mayor of Petrini's hometown of Bra. But now it has become a much broader cultural discussion about the benefits of doing things in a more human, less frenetic manner. Slow food, slow cities, slow medicine, slow schooling, slow media, slow cinema. All movements built on the radical but effective strategy of offering people a slower, more sustainable alternative to modern busyness that draws from time-tested wisdom. As I learned more about these ideas in my reporting on knowledge work, a natural follow-up thought emerged. Maybe when it comes to combating the inhumanity of our current moment of professional overload, what we really need, more so than righteous disdain or brash new policy, is a slower conception of what it even means to be productive in the first place. In search of a better alternative, One of the intriguing developments of the immediate post-pandemic period is the opportunity it presents for major overhauls of how knowledge work operates. The disruptive retreat to virtual meetings and home offices in the spring of 2020 shook this sector out of its business-as-usual complacency. As the distraction of the health emergency dissipated, more than a few former cubicle dwellers were left wondering what other major changes might be possible. We see this new attitude reflected in the wrangling that emerged between employees and bosses over plans to return to office buildings. In the spring of 2022, when Apple CEO Tim Cook announced that employees would be required to work in person at the company's Cupertino headquarters at least some days each week, the protest and response was swift and intense. "Stop treating us like school kids who need to be told when to be where and what homework to do," demanded an open letter addressed to Cook by an employee group called Apple Together. In the months that followed, Cook repeatedly delayed the office return plan in response to this resistance. A full year after Cook's original announcement, as I'm writing this chapter, the battle continues, with Cook now openly threatening to punish employees who still refuse to return. Those frustrated Apple employees aren't just arguing about their commutes, I wrote in a New Yorker article reporting on this fight. They're at the vanguard of a movement that's leveraging the disruptions of the pandemic to question so many more of the arbitrary assumptions that have come to define the modern workplace. This new focus on major transformations is also reflected in rising interest in the 4-day workweek. In February 2023, the UK released the results of a large-scale pilot study that followed more than 60 companies that experimented with a reduced schedule. As the BBC reported, the results were overwhelmingly positive, with more than 90% of the participating companies claiming they would keep going with the experimental setup, at least for now. Here in America, California Congressman Mark Takano proposed legislation that would officially reduce the standard workweek, as established by the Fair Labor Standards Act, from 40 to 32 hours. Though his bill didn't gain traction, companies such as Lowe's and Kickstarter are already experimenting with these shorter schedules on their own. This sudden interest in workplace experimentation is both welcome and needed, as much about how we work in the knowledge sector today is ossified into tradition and conventions, some of which are arbitrary and some of which are borrowed from different older types of work. The proposals making waves at the moment, however, feel somehow insufficient on their own. Moves to maintain telecommuting or reduce the workweek help blunt some of the worst side effects of pseudo-productivity, but do little to address the root problem itself. These ideas are the work equivalent of responding to the growth of fast food culture. By demanding McDonald's make its meals somewhat more nutritious, it would help tame some of the health impacts of this food, but not challenge the culture that makes hasty eating necessary in the first place. As Carlo Petrini taught us, a more sustainable response to the burnout crisis facing knowledge work would be to offer an appealing alternative. This would require moving beyond attempts to simply constrain pseudo-productivity to instead propose a brand new vision of what productivity can mean. The challenge, of course, is figuring out the details of such an alternative. This is where Petrini's second big idea becomes relevant: draw from time-tested ideas. If we informally think of knowledge work as people sitting in office buildings typing into computers, we might despair about finding traditional wisdom relevant to such a decidedly modern activity. To make progress with Petrini's slow framework, let's instead consider the following more expansive formulation. Knowledge work, general definition. The economic activity in which knowledge is transformed into an artifact with market value through the application of cognitive effort. This definition still captures standard office-bound employees, such as computer programmers, marketers, accountants, executives, and so on. But it now also captures many other cognitive professions that have been around longer than the age of cubicles. By this definition, for example, writers are knowledge workers, as are philosophers, scientists, musicians, playwrights, and artists. These more traditional cognitive professions, of course, are often more rarefied than standard office jobs. Professional musicians, or Renaissance scientists supported by patrons, have way more flexibility and options in designing their work life than, say, an HR coordinator. It's easy to therefore reject these case studies with a dismissive nod to privilege. I can see the tweet now, "It must be nice to have Lorenzo de' Medici paying your bills." Though satisfying, this isn't a useful response given our broader goals. It's exactly these rarefied freedoms that make traditional knowledge workers interesting to our project, as it provided them the space and time needed to experiment and figure out what works best when it comes to sustainably creating valuable things using the human brain. Of course, most of us cannot directly replicate the specific details of, say, John McPhee's workday. What we're looking for, however, is not a blueprint to follow exactly, but general ideas that we can export from this exotic territory to the more pragmatic constraints of standard 21st century knowledge sector jobs. I might not be able to spend 2 full weeks lying on a picnic table in my backyard, but there's a key insight lurking in that story about the value of slowing down to prepare to tackle a hard project. If we can get over our frustration that these traditional knowledge workers enjoyed privileges that we don't have access to, we might find in their experience the foundations for a conception of productivity that makes our harder jobs more manageable. Once you start looking for these McPhee-style slower professional habits among traditional knowledge workers, it's easy to find a variety of examples. Consider Isaac Newton working through the details of calculus in the countryside north of Cambridge University, or a sculptor named Anna Rubinkamp, who documented in a beautifully edited video posted online how she plies her craft in a utilitarian studio in South London, the doors thrown open to a quiet tree-lined patio beyond. The reader who sent me this clip titled her message "Epitome of Deep Work." I agreed. A particularly entertaining diversion is uncovering the eccentric spaces where famous novelists would hide away to write. As I'll elaborate later, Peter Benchley, the author of Jaws, composed his classic thriller in the back room of a furnace repair shop, and Maya Angelou preferred scrawling on legal pads while propped up on her elbows on generic hotel room beds. By early 2022, I was finally ready to pull together all my thoughts on how to apply Carlo Petrini's slow movement framework to the problems generated by pseudo-productivity. It was in an article that I published around that time that I gave my emerging philosophy a name, a natural title given the sources of my inspiration, that I've used ever since: slow productivity. A new philosophy. The second part of this book is dedicated to elaborating a philosophy of slow productivity, an alternative framework knowledge workers can use to organize and execute tasks that sidesteps the hurry and ever-expanding workloads generated by pseudo-productivity. My goal is to offer a more humane and sustainable way to integrate professional efforts into a life well lived. To embrace slow productivity, in other words, is to reorient your work to be a source of meaning instead of overwhelm, while still maintaining the ability to produce valuable output. To better understand what this entails, let's return to the formal definition first presented in the introduction. A philosophy for organizing knowledge work efforts in a sustainable and meaningful manner, based on the following 3 principles. 1. Do fewer things. 2. Work at a natural pace. 3. Obsess over quality. At the core of this philosophy are 3 central principles. Accordingly, part 2 of this book is divided into 3 long chapters, one for each of these ideas. I start these chapters by explaining the corresponding recommendation, providing justification for why it's critical to the goal of achieving a more sustainable work life. These justifications are then followed by a series of propositions that detail specific ideas for implementing the principle within the messy realities of a standard knowledge work job. It's here that you'll find concrete advice and strategies that you can adapt as needed to your particular professional circumstance. Each chapter also includes an interlude, which provides self-reflective commentary and critique on the ideas being developed. I included these sections to underscore the reality that these ideas are new and complicated, and not everyone will receive them the same way. My hope is that you'll bring your own unique experiences to these propositions, allowing you to cultivate your own unique collection of insights and conclusions in response. True to Carlo Petrini's vision, Part 2 is rich in stories and examples drawn from the lives of traditional knowledge workers in a variety of different fields and time periods. You'll learn, for example, about Jane Austen, Ben Franklin, and Galileo, in addition to somewhat more modern figures such as Georgia O'Keeffe, Lin-Manuel Miranda, and Mary Oliver. I'll use these stories as the source of the ideas that I'll then polish into more pragmatic advice, adapted to the realities of modern jobs. But it's worth noting that the general mindset and mood conveyed in these tales are also of standalone value. Following Petrini's lead, I'm convinced that one of the best ways to truly introduce you to the lost art of accomplishment without burnout is to immerse you in the world of those who successfully built their lives around this goal. Before diving into these specifics, however, I want to reassure you that slow productivity doesn't ask that you extinguish ambition. Humans derive great satisfaction from being good at what they do and producing useful things. This philosophy can be understood as providing a more sustainable path toward these achievements. Few people know, for example, how long it actually took Isaac Newton to develop all the ideas contained in his masterwork, the Principia. Over 20 years. They just know that his book, once published, changed science forever. The value of his ideas lives on, while the lazy pace at which they were produced was soon forgotten. Slow productivity supports legacy-building accomplishments, but allows them to unfold at a more human speed. Though this book is about knowledge work productivity in general, it targets in particular anyone who has a reasonable degree of autonomy in their job. This obviously includes freelancers, solopreneurs, and those who run small businesses. Pseudo-productivity's presence in these particular settings is not due to a boss's demands, but is instead largely self-imposed, which opens up vast potential for individual experimentation. My imagined audience, however, also includes those who might work for larger employers, but still enjoy significant freedom in how they go about their work. As a professor, for example, I fall into this latter definition, as would, say, a product designer who is expected to effectively disappear until she's ready to bring a new idea back to the team, or a fully remote worker whose output is tracked only at a rough granularity. Those who instead work in an office environment under close supervision might have a harder time fully instituting the strategies I suggest, as will those whose efforts are highly structured, such as a doctor moving through an inflexible patient schedule, or a first-year law associate evaluated primarily on their accumulation of billable hours. This is not to say that slow productivity cannot one day reform these corners of knowledge work as well. See my discussion in the conclusion of this book about my broader vision for the future of this movement. But every revolution needs a starting point, and for something as momentous as rethinking the very notion of productivity itself, it makes sense to focus at first on those for whom self-experimentation is possible. It's with these goals and caveats in mind that we now proceed. Part 2. Do fewer things. The first principle of slow productivity. In late October 1811, an advertisement in a London newspaper promoted a new novel by a lady. The author's name was not given, but in a subsequent advertisement appearing the next month, she was more specifically identified as Lady A. The book was Sense and Sensibility, and the pseudonymous author, of course, was Jane Austen, making her publishing debut. Austen had spent more than a decade working on a collection of manuscripts that she was now, seemingly all at once, polishing into impressive final forms. Sense and Sensibility initiated a remarkable 5-year run of publishing, arguably unmatched in the history of modern literature, that saw Austen soon after also release Pride and Prejudice, Mansfield Park, and then finally, in 1815, Emma. 2 years later, she died, all of only 41 years old. A popular explanation for Austen's productivity is that she mastered the art of writing secretly, scribbling prose in bursts between the many distracting obligations of her social standing. The source of this idea was Austen's nephew James, who in 1869, more than 50 years after Austen's death, published a gauzy Victorian biography of his aunt that helped expose her works to a broader audience. In Chapter 6 of this memoir, James provides the following memorable description. How she was able to effect all this is surprising, for she had no separate study to retire to, and most of the work must have been done in the general sitting room, subject to all kinds of casual interruptions. She was careful that her occupation should not be suspected by servants or visitors or any persons beyond her own family party. She wrote upon small sheets of paper which could easily be put away or covered with a piece of blotting paper. There was, between the front door and the offices, a swing door which creaked when it was opened, but she objected to having this little inconvenience remedied because it gave her notice when anyone was coming. This story of the aspiring but frustrated gentlewoman surreptitiously plying her craft could have come straight out of one of Austen's novels. Not surprisingly, given this pleasing symmetry, this myth stuck. It's retold in modern accounts such as Mason Curry's delightful 2013 book, Daily Rituals. as well as in older attempts to grapple with Austen's world. Yet Jane Austen was glad that a hinge creaked, so that she might hide her manuscript before anyone came in, repeats Virginia Woolf in 1929 in A Room of One's Own. This story can serve multiple purposes. Woolf, for example, uses it as part of an argument about gender roles and intellectual autonomy. Less sophisticated accounts enshrine it as a devotional about not giving up on your dreams. But when we turn our focus to the topic of productivity, James's portrayal of his aunt becomes suddenly disquieting. It seems to endorse a model of production in which better results require you to squeeze ever more work into your schedule. The obstacle standing between you and your own sense and sensibility, it implies, is a willingness to do more. Austen used small gaps between interminable social visits to write on scraps of paper in her sitting room. So why can't you wake up at 5 a.m. or make better use of your lunch hour? A closer look at Austen's life, however, soon reveals issues with her nephew's tales of secret writing. Modern biographies, drawing more extensively from primary source material, reveal that the real Jane Austen was not an exemplar of a grinded-out busyness, but instead a powerful case study of something quite different, a slower approach to productivity. Jane Austen grew up in late 18th century England, in the rural Hampshire village of Steventon, on what was essentially a small working farm. There were cows to milk and poultry to tend. Her family baked bread and brewed their own beer. In the summer, the kids were given hay rakes and boiled jams and jellies. In the fall, they helped bring in the harvest. While Austen was still a young girl, her father, the rector for their parish, turned the parsonage in which they lived into an impromptu boys' school, adding the demands of the care and feeding of a half-dozen stampeding boys to the list of daily chores. This is not to say that the Austen family was strictly working class. As Claire Tomlin explains in her 1997 biography, Jane Austen, a life they inhabited a social world of pseudo-gentry, made up of families who aspired to live by the values of the gentry without owning land or inherited wealth of any significance. But it's clear that Austen did not grow up like a character in one of her books, spending her days in a well-appointed sitting room, taking visitors while servants prepared lavish meals. She had work to do. Though Austen was a voracious reader and, encouraged by her father, began dabbling in writing at a young age, she was much too busy with the daily work of running her family's house farm and school to seriously explore the craft. This all changed in the summer of 1796, when Austen's father decided to close the boys' school run out of their house. This led to the easing of all the work involved in the planning and preparation of meals, laundry, cleaning, and bed-making, writes Tomlin. And with her obligations suddenly dramatically reduced, Austen entered a period of phenomenal productivity. Working at an upstairs desk, reading drafts of her work to her family during the evening, she produced early versions of what would eventually become 3 major novels. As Tomlin emphasizes, it was Austen's ability to abstract herself from the daily life going on around her that allowed her to find her literary voice. In 1800s, this period of greatly reduced responsibilities abruptly ended when Austen's parents decided, seemingly out of nowhere, to shut down the house in Steventon and move to the resort town of Bath. For the next decade, Austen found herself constantly on the move, navigating the transition from one new household to another, taking on more duties as she coped with the sickness and eventual death of her father. Robbed of the ability to establish the rhythm of work, as Tomlin puts it, Austen stopped writing. The world would have been denied Austen's brilliance if not for a fateful decision made in 1809 that swung the conditions for productivity dramatically back in Austen's favor. Exhausted from the tumultuous past decade, Austen, along with her mother, her sister Cassandra, and their family friend Martha Lloyd, settled into a modest cottage, positioned at the crossroads of the sleepy town of Chawton. The house was part of a large estate, owned by Austen's brother Edward, who had inherited the land from distant relatives of the Austen family who never had kids of their own, and had years earlier named Edward their legal heir. Critically for Austen's work, her family, wrung out from the complications and trials of the preceding years, embraced a much-needed respite by deciding to largely absent themselves from the social scene in Chawton. This was not a decision made lightly. The fact that Austen's brother essentially owned the town and lived in an impressive estate just a few hundred yards down the road meant that opportunities for active social striving were likely abundant. But the Austin party wasn't interested. There were no dances and few dinners, writes Tomlin, and they remained largely withdrawn into their private activities. Austin's mother, now in her 70s, took to working in the garden of their cottage, wearing the frock of a day laborer, to the amusement of other town residents. Equally important, a tacit agreement was formed that would free the youngest Austin daughter from most of the remaining household labor. She prepared the morning breakfast for the family, but beyond this duty, was free to write. In this way, she was privileged with a general exemption from domestic chores when Cass and Martha were at home, explains Tomlin. Hidden from the world at Chawton Cottage, suddenly almost miraculously free of most responsibilities both domestic and social, Austin, for the first time in over a decade, had gained real and meaningful space to think and work creatively. It's here, working at a modest writing desk by a window overlooking the road, that she finally finishes the manuscripts for Sense and Sensibility and Pride and Prejudice before moving on to compose Mansfield Park and Emma. Austin's nephew may have popularized the story of an overscheduled Austin, prim and proper in her sitting room, working in frenzied bursts between incessant distractions, but the reality of her remarkable years at Chawton is clearly quite different. Far from glamorizing a surreptitious, disciplined busyness, Austin's story, when told properly, seems to promote the opposite of this approach. Austin was not able to produce creatively during the crowded periods of her life. It was only when, through circumstance and contrivance, her obligations were greatly reduced that Austin was able, finally, to complete her best work. This lesson that doing less can enable better results defies our contemporary bias toward activity, based on the belief that doing more keeps our options open and generates more opportunities for reward. But recall that busy Jane Austen was neither happy nor producing memorable work. While unburdened Jane Austen, writing contently at quiet Chawton Cottage, transformed English literature. Indeed, simplifying is so important to our emerging philosophy that I'll enshrine it here as the official first principle of slow productivity. Principle #1 Do fewer things. Strive to reduce your obligations to the point where you can easily imagine accomplishing them with time to spare. Leverage this reduced load to more fully embrace and advance the small number of projects that matter most. The request made here, of course, is easier explained than actually implemented. In the context of your professional life, busyness likely seems unavoidable. Clients demand attention, and managers drown you in requests. Even if you're a solopreneur in full control of your days, the need for income might undermine your intention to reduce your workload. Jane Austen's long writing sessions at her desk in Chawton Cottage can seem a fantastic mirage for the knowledge worker facing an endlessly full inbox. My goal in this chapter is to persuade you not to give up on this aspirational vision of engineered simplicity. It is possible in most modern work settings if you're willing to be creative and perhaps at times even radical in how you think about selecting and organizing your work. In the pages ahead, I'll detail my case for why a commitment to simplicity can be just as beneficial and achievable in modern knowledge work as it was for Austen's Victorian-era fiction writing, and then detail some concrete tactics for implementing this first principle of slow productivity. From Chawton Cottage to the cubicle, or why knowledge workers should do fewer things. In the spring of 2021, a program manager at HSBC named Jonathan Frostick, working remotely from his home office, suffered a heart attack. We know this because he subsequently posted